Hello, my name is Horace Horton, and my family and I moved back to Maine in 1973, and we've never contemplated moving anywhere else but living in Yarmouth. It's such a great community. So during our time in Yarmouth, my wife has taught school, and she also taught in Cumberland and Falmouth as a substitute teacher while our two girls were growing up through the Yarmouth schools. I'm a lawyer, and I started with the Portland firm of Drummond and Drummond in 1973, and I have just finished my 50th year with that firm and don't plan to retire soon. And I've had a great career. I've enjoyed it very much. I was born in Blue Hill in Hancock County up near Bar Harbor, and grew up on a farm, a small dairy farm there called Millbrook Farm. I have a twin brother, and the reason that's important, along with other reasons, is that in 1965, he joined the Navy, having gone to the Naval Academy, and I graduated from the University of Maine, having taken ROTC for a couple of years and disliked it immensely. However, I met my now wife, and we were married 2 weeks after graduation in June of 1965. We both went off to Washington, D.C. with jobs. I worked for the National Security Agency at Fort Meade, started right in July, right after we graduated from college. She taught school down there. We had a great first summer in Washington, except for the heat. Labor Day weekend, we came back to Maine to see our parents, and my father handed me a letter that said, "Please report for your physical." Now you have to remember when that was. 1965, the fall of 65. Vietnam was just building, and the draft was heavy, and they were breathing down my neck. So I called my twin brother, and I said, "You're in the Navy. I'm going to have to go in. I think I'll volunteer so that I hopefully can get something I would like to do." I said, "But you're in the Navy. I don't want to do that." So I just checked out the different options. Air Force was 4 years after officer candidate school. The Army was 2 years after officer candidate school. And I didn't look at the Marines. So it was kind of a foregone conclusion that I would go to OCS. And I ultimately did, leaving on Valentine's Day of February 1966 for Fort Knox, Kentucky, where I subsequently took basic training, advanced training, and then OCS in armor there at Fort Knox. After Fort Knox, I went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for some training in psychological warfare and intelligence work. I then went back to Fort Knox, being assigned as an assistant commander in a training unit. And then after a few months, I got those orders that we all didn't want to see, but we knew it was coming, to go to Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, for Vietnamese language school. So you know what the next tour of duty was following that. So most of 1968 I spent in Vietnam, and I was detached to the 7th Psychological Operations Battalion out of Saigon, and different units of that battalion were assigned around South Vietnam. I happened to get sent to Da Nang up in I Corps, the northern part of South Vietnam. And I must say I enjoyed that as much as I could say I enjoyed anything there, but it was good duty. And the year bore on, and I spent R&R in Hawaii. My wife flew over, and that was a wonderful week. And then in August, I took a few days with a little TDY up to Okinawa to see a Marine Corps buddy of mine. And then came home just before Christmas, December 17, 1968. You always remember those dates. After wondering what we were going to do for a while, and we were staying with my wife's mother in Kittery, we decided to go back to Washington. I had restoration rights to my job at the National Security Agency, so I told them I was coming back, and I did. But I also knew I wanted to go to law school. So I then proceeded to look around for a law school that I could do at night, and that was the University of Maryland in Baltimore. That turned out to be a great situation. It took 4 years because I continued to work at NSA during the day for those 4 years. 2 daughters later, and a law degree, we came back to Maine and Yarmouth, which is where I started the story. And since then, it's been a wonderful life. We've enjoyed it so much. Our daughters went through school here, and it was a terrific time, and still is, and we wouldn't move anywhere else. After officer candidate school, as I said, I went to the Psychological Operations Warfare School at Fort Bragg, and that was really interesting. There were Army soldiers there from Thailand, from South Vietnam, from Laos, and a few other countries. Obviously, we were helping them, and one young lieutenant from South Vietnam I actually ran into after I went there in 1968. Wonderful young man, and we really became good close friends. Also a good friend from Thailand, a captain, became good friends of our family, and I thought the world of the soldiers from Thailand and South Korea, as a matter of fact. They were terrific. My best friend from Thailand actually sent both my daughters carved elephants from Thailand, and we really became close. And you wonder what happened to all those guys, but that's a whole part of the story of the Vietnam conflict. So following Psychological Warfare School at Fort Bragg, then back to Fort Knox for a few months, and then to Fort Bliss, El Paso, Texas, for Vietnamese language. That was a very interesting time as well. Our class of about 15 or 20 Army officers, ranging from a new second lieutenant, that's me, on up to majors and colonels, and we're all in this class together learning Vietnamese. And the teachers were young Vietnamese, mostly women, mostly in their native dress, and we got to know them as teachers, and they told us that they had come to the United States to serve as teachers for us, and most of them went to Paris. And you remember the history of that was that the French Army left Vietnam after the fall of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and I think a lot of Vietnamese soldiers and probably civilians emigrated to France after that. And so these teachers trying to teach us Vietnamese, which wasn't easy, they were all the children of those people that were my age who had left Vietnam. So it was interesting talking with them about Vietnam and what was going on there, and of course the involvement by the United States and the South Korean soldiers and Marines were there, and they were terrific. They were a tough bunch, but they helped us so much. So following that school, which was 3 months, I believe, then a little bit of time off before those of us in that class all went over about the same time to Vietnam. And that was just before Christmas in 1967. So that year, and I came back just before Christmas of 1968. So going to Vietnam, was an adventure in itself. None of us, of course, had ever been there. All we heard was what was going on over there at that time. One interesting tidbit that I remember, my high school class in Blue Hill in 1961, right after that, and if you remember your history, Vietnam was just starting. The very beginning of the conflict there was starting. And one of our high school buddies, my twin brother and I, actually went over. He was in the Army. He was in ordnance. And he went over and he wrote us back a letter. And first of all, we all had to go look at a map and figure out where Vietnam was, and then where he was in Vietnam. None of us knew much about Vietnam, where it was, what it was all about. But from that point on, Fred would stay in touch with us. He came back after a year over there, spent a career in the Army, and we kept in touch with him until his death a year ago. That was our first inkling of Vietnam and what was going on there. But a wonderful guy, and we miss him terribly. My duty in Vietnam was interesting. Again, our headquarters was in near Saigon, or outside of Saigon, and there were detachments from the 7th Psychological Operations Battalion that were sent off to the southern part of South Vietnam, to the western part, to the northeastern part in Nha Trang, and the northern part in Da Nang, which is where I was sent with a unit from the Saigon Battalion. We lived in the city of Saigon in an old French hotel, and we shared an Army compound with the South Vietnamese. Getting to know them was a challenge. We often thought that they were not as committed as we were, and some of their actions really revealed that they were not. However, we helped them as much as we could. We suffered through mortar attacks and all, not so much in Da Nang, but we were detached, although we lived in that old French hotel right in the middle of the city. Our detachment was sent out to work with the 1st Marine Division, which was just west of Da Nang at Freedom Hill. That was great. My small detachment actually stayed with the Marines at Freedom Hill, and I got to know some of those young officers, and we had a great time. The Seabees were an important part of our duty over there because they would build USO buildings, they would build racquetball courts, which we used for handball back in those days, and they were great. And so that's what we did in our off-duty hours, as well as frequent the officer clubs in the middle of Da Nang. The Marines, of course, a great fighting force. They were asked to come into Vietnam, hit the beaches, take over, and then the Army came afterwards and built all of our units, all of our headquarters, and all of that. Being a Army lieutenant and a detachment chief, I had my own fleet of vehicles. I had my own Jeep, and meanwhile, the Marine officers, the young officers, had no vehicles, and so I became a fast friend as they wanted to go into the city or get a ride to the PX or whatever, or to the USO. So it was kind of fun. That part of it was a lot of fun. And we spent a lot of time together at the USO and the officers' clubs, again, right in Da Nang. I remember full well the Navy Officers Club called the Stone Elephant. And anyone who was in Da Nang or that area will remember it well. Lots of bands and evenings out there. And Da Nang I'm sure today is a wonderful, lovely city, which it was before the French, and then we served there and fought there. Da Nang was right on the water, had some wonderful headquarters, and I'm sure the senior officers in charge of the 1st Marine Division and other units all had wonderful places to stay. Ours were okay, but not great. But we were near a beach, called China Beach, right near the headquarters of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force. And that's ultimately who was the officer in charge of the whole I Corps. So I spent my year there, some in the city of Da Nang in that old French hotel, and then some out with the 1st Marine Division, and then we would go on trips throughout that area. And what our unit did was to support the 1st Marine Division, their G5 and G2 units. We did some intelligence work with POWs, and the psychological operations part of what we did was to assign planes to drop leaflets and send out teams of people with loudspeakers trying to get the Vietnamese population on our side, and also trying to get POWs from the North Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, and the North Vietnamese, and that whole system, which was just more than the United States had bargained for, which ultimately was what happened, and we left Vietnam really having not accomplished a heck of a lot and losing many men. But that was my tour of duty, and a good buddy of mine who was with me from OCS on through, he and I came back and landed on the West Coast, and we got out of the Army, got out of active duty when we landed there on December 17, 1968. I stayed in the reserves afterwards, wanting to keep my options open as to going to law school, coming back to Maine, practicing law, what I was going to do. So I stayed in the reserves long enough to get promoted to captain, which is what I ultimately retired as after I had passed the bar exam and started practicing law in Portland, which is where I still am today. My wife and I still live in Yarmouth, as I said at the beginning. Our daughters are now married and off with children of their own, but we're going to stay right here in Yarmouth for the duration. We love it here and wouldn't go anyplace else. When I first joined the military, and again, I and hundreds of thousands of others, Americans, did that. I had 2 years of ROTC at the University of Maine, which was obligatory at that time, which isn't anymore, and I really didn't like it at all. So the fact that the draft was getting close and I volunteered to go in was a real adjustment to think that there might be something I would like in the military after my experiences with ROTC. In between there, though, I visited my twin brother, again, a Navy officer in Norfolk, Virginia, and I got a little taste of what he was going through as a young officer. And so I tried to kind of pattern my behavior and my command presence after what I saw him doing and what he was going through. But it did take an adjustment, particularly after basic AIT and then OCS. OCS pretty much prepares you for being an officer, and it did take some preparation work, I must say. But I fell into it pretty quickly because my commanding officer back at Fort Knox at the Armor School was a wonderful man. He had been to Vietnam twice already, and he just was a terrific commander. And he had been an enlisted man and had received an appointment as an officer from his duty as an enlisted man. So I really had some great mentors. My brother to that degree, but mostly this commanding officer at Fort Knox named Arthur Minifield, captain, and a wonderful infantry officer. But I did do some adjustments, and I think I ended up a pretty decent officer, having gone through the ranks of basic AIT and then OCS before I became an officer and had an assignment. So I think I did it all right, but it certainly was an adjustment, for sure. During my tour of duty in Vietnam, I was not actively involved in what you'd say frontline combat. I was pretty much back at a rear headquarters, but we had our own vehicles, so we would take trips out to units and work with the different field units, and I enjoyed that. We all had fear, but for the most part, you get over that while you were there. And I enjoyed taking pictures, for instance, and sending back home pictures of different temples, particularly in the city of Da Nang, but also out in the countryside, and a lot of children. I enjoyed doing that. So that was part of my interesting tour. I knew just enough Vietnamese to say, "How are you? Good morning. Don't shoot." All those important phrases. And just a sidelight, in my law practice in the Portland area, I started to represent some folks who were immigrating to that area. And a young man who actually had come from Vietnam came in with an interpreter to my office. And she started talking with me, and she was Vietnamese as well. And then she would turn to him and interpret what I was saying. And all of a sudden I said, "I've got to say something here." So I said, time out, please. I just want to tell you," and I looked at him. I knew he knew some English, but I said, "Please, I just want you to know that I know a little Vietnamese, so bear with me if I try to say a few words, but don't try to say things kind of behind my back." And they were amazed, of course, first of all, that I could say a few words in Vietnamese, but it really broke the ice, and we've had a great relationship ever since, and I enjoyed that, meeting him, and he's now has his own business in the Portland area, which I've helped him with, and so I'm very fond of those memories. One other instance where I learned something from my experience that I've used later in life. I was a very active Boy Scout growing up, and still am, and I'm on the Boy Scout Council board here in Cumberland County. While I was in Vietnam, I ran across some scouts in the city of Da Nang, and some of them spoke enough English to ask me to come to their meeting and talk about scouting in the United States. And it was kind of interesting. I wanted to talk and try my Vietnamese out, but they all wanted to speak English. And so we had this back and forth where we both realized it, but the scouts, the young kids, were just wonderful, and I so enjoyed that and have some great pictures of that instance. And what I did eventually was to teach them some English. So my skills teaching foreigners how to speak English and just interact with them as a teacher, I've used in my professional career teaching various courses in the law. But I remember I got the training as to how to do it from my time in Vietnam with the Scouts. Reflecting back on my service in Vietnam, I think that that tour of duty has impacted how I view international relations today. For instance, what's going on in Israel and the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt today, and what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia today. I look at it as, and many of us do, as a waste of resources, not only human resources, but money and armaments, and not helping international relations in any way. And I think while we have to stand up for our rights, and I say that in full support of the Israelis, still you wonder, isn't there a better way to have international relations? And look at Russia with Ukraine, just unbelievable. And there's not enough power among the, I don't mean to get too political, but there's not enough uprising by the common people in the Soviet Union, in Russia, to overthrow Putin, because he is just wasting away the human resources of Russia, as well as money and food, armaments, and it doesn't help human relations one iota. So I think I'm a very strong proponent of standing your ground, as does Ukraine, as does Israel. Still, I recognize the problems and hope that we'll find peaceful solutions before long. Staying in touch with friends and family back home while I was in Vietnam was a real challenge. We didn't have iPhones or iPads. We had to stand in line, I think it was Sunday night, and there'd be several dozen GIs standing in line to use one payphone. And we would call back, and we would have, I think, 3 minutes max that you could talk with your wife or your children back home. And of course, you'd have to set that up ahead of time. They'd have to know you were going to call, or you were going to try to call between 7 and 8 o'clock that time, which was quite a bit different from back here in the States. That whole communication issue today is amazing. I mean, soldiers on the front lines have iPhones and computers and electronic communications. It is just so different today. That would lead you into other discussions about drone warfare and how different warfare is today. But communications. And that's a benefit, of course, to the GIs, all military men, to be able to stay in touch with your family. And I don't know, but I think people rotate more often from tours of duty overseas, or perhaps their loved ones are in Germany and at U.S. bases while they may be in Ukraine as a training component. But communications today, it doesn't make it any easier to be away from your family or to be in the military, but it sure is easier to get in touch, and that helps the insides when you're in combat and trying to stay in touch and remember how your family, and so your children know who you are and all. So it's quite a bit different today than it was in the Vietnam days of the 60s. I think when we returned from Vietnam in those days, and again, you have to remember what was going on back here in the States. All the riots, race riots, anti-Vietnam riots, Kent State, all of those things were going on back here. In 1968, for instance, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated while we were over there in 1968. And we said, what is going on back in the States? And feeling the anti-war sentiment that we all did when we returned, we came home, we took off our uniforms. And it was a while before we put them back on and would join American Legions or march in parades after things changed and toned down. And then gradually you felt proud of your service, not particularly of Vietnam and what we did and how we left there, not unlike Afghanistan. There's another failure that was orchestrated perhaps by the politicians. But eventually I became proud of my service and coming back home and then participating not only here in Yarmouth, but elsewhere, the whole area, being a good citizen and helping others and helping local government And I started off with the Boy Scout beginnings, and I'll end with that. I'm really active in Scouts. I always said whatever I learned in the Army, I first learned in Boy Scouts. That is orienteering, simple things, starting a fire, how to camp, and all those sorts of things. Morse code, you know, on and on. So I'm proud of my service, and I'm proud of what I'm doing afterwards in my career. Thank you.